Our text today comes from Exodus chapter 14. If you want to follow along in your pew Bibles. Kids that just got Bibles, it's on page 74. Adults, it's the second book of the Bible. I didn't look up the page number for you, but Genesis, Exodus 14 is where we're headed. I love this. So Exodus 14, starting with verse 10, and we'll go kind of through 30-ish. So what's happened is we have Moses. Everybody was slaves in Egypt, and Moses says, look, slavery is no good. Let's get out of there. And so it's a very condensed version of the story. But anyway, so they're on the move. They're in the wilderness. But of course, Pharaoh is not happy about this, and they are being chased. And that's where we see the story today. And they've come up to this sea, and they don't know what to do. They're like, well, we don't have any boats. We can't swim across. It's way too far. What are we going to do? As Pharaoh drew near, the Israelites looked back, and there were the Egyptians advancing on them. In great fear, the Israelites cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you have taken us away to die in the wilderness? What have you done to us, bringing us out of Egypt? Is this not the very thing we told you? Let us alone, and let us serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the wilderness." But Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and see the deliverance that the Lord will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to keep still." Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night and turned the sea into dry land, and the waters were divided. The Israelites went into the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. The Egyptians pursued and went into the sea after them, all of Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and chariot drivers. At the morning watch, the Lord in the pillar of fire and cloud looked down upon the Egyptian army and threw the Egyptian army into panic. The Lord clogged their chariot wheels so that they turned with difficulty. The Egyptians said, "Let us flee from the Israelites, for the Lord is fighting for them against Egypt." Then the Lord said to Moses, "Stretch out your hand over the sea, so that the water may come back upon the Egyptians, upon their chariots and chariot drivers." So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at dawn the sea returned to its normal depth. As the Egyptians fled before it, the Lord tossed the Egyptians into the sea. The waters returned and covered the chariots and the chariot drivers, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed them into the sea. Not one of them remained. But the Israelites walked on dry ground through the sea, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Now, this text is wonderful and terrible for all of the same reasons. It's a very famous story, right? There have been countless movie renditions and references, from Charlton Heston to Bruce Almighty parting the Red Soup, if you remember that. Even the Israelites kept telling this story over and over for the rest of their history, reminding each other of this amazing moment of freedom and delivery from their enemies. But the problem is that because it's so famous, it's easy to forget what it's really about, or to think that it matters for us today. I need to start by being really, really clear about one thing. Because here's the thing about the text. It looks like God is playing favorites. As though God had held a popularity contest and decided, like some mean girl in high school, to arbitrarily pick one group to be in this week, while the rest were the kids who, for no good reason, got left out. When looked at this way, this text makes us anxious, wondering if we're in the cool kids group or the left out group, wondering what we can do to be cool enough and good enough to be chosen by God. It makes us insecure about our status in this illogical game. It's so hard to guess the whims of these mean girls. Now, luckily, and hear me say this clearly, luckily, this is not what this story is about. Instead of looking at it as the chosen cool kids, instead of worrying if we're in the cool kids group, let's look at who the groups really are here. We hear Pharaoh, and we know that he wasn't great, right? It's easy to be removed from what was actually going on simply because it's a story that happened so long ago. And we hear about these pharaohs in school, and we learn about mummification and all the hieroglyphics, and we're like, they were just the kings of Egypt. Yes, but, and I'm not speaking for all pharaohs here, I'm sure some of them were nice guys, but this one in particular seemed to be pretty nasty. Like tyrant, dictator, oppressor, nasty. So when Pharaoh and all of his men drowned in the Red Sea, it's about evil and oppression and tragedy and enslavement and violence and bullying being drowned. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a great sermon on this text, and one of my greatest challenges this week was not just to plagiarize the whole thing and read it to you guys, but I'm going to do it a little, but I'm telling you that it's his. So he explains this really, really well, and he writes, "This story symbolizes something basic about the universe. It symbolizes something much deeper than the drowning of a few men, because no one can rejoice at the death and defeat of a human person. This story at bottom symbolizes the death of evil. It was the death of inhuman oppression and ungodly exploitation. The death of the Egyptians upon the seashore is a glaring symbol of the ultimate doom of evil in its struggle with good. There is something in the very nature of the universe which is on the side of Israel in its struggle with every Egypt. There is something in the very nature of the universe which ultimately comes to the aid of goodness in its perennial struggle with evil." See why I wanted to give you that whole sermon? And I think he's right. It is our great hope and our great conviction that gradually the evils of the world are swept away with the tide, and that goodness, mercy, justice, and love move forward. But I think there's still more to this text than that. While I'm so glad to say a resounding yes to hope, I'm curious about what it's like for us when we are in these moments. Because while it's so easy to fast forward and say everything works out, which it always does eventually, that doesn't help us much when we are standing at that shore, facing impassable waters with terror on our heels. So what do we do in these moments? We see these moments all over the Bible, and our story today is part of a book called Exodus, which means these people left behind everything they knew and ventured into the wilderness, trusting in God, but wandering for a while. And God used this uncertain time as a great teacher for the people. This is the same for us, the times when we feel lost, confused, maybe even abandoned. When we start to whine, maybe just a little bit, like the Israelites did in today's text. I love this part. What, they didn't have graves in Egypt? You had to walk us into the middle of the desert to die? We would rather be in slavery to the old ways than face the uncertainty and unknown of this desert. Have we not said those words? Those uncomfortable times are often the periods of our greatest growth. So what have those times been for you? Times when the unendurable thing happens, when sorrow takes our whole attention. Moments like waiting for the doctor to call with the test results, relationships changing or ending, losing a job, the long and rocky road of addiction, the fear and despair that creep in a little bit more every time you catch the headlines or the evening news. There are plenty of times when we have thought, I don't know what to do. I feel totally lost. I can't see how this is ever going to work out. And here is where we get to the real beauty of this text, the part that is a balm for my heart. Because let me be clear, I know what this feels like. I have been there. We all have. I have been frozen and frightened and full of emotions, completely unsure of where to go or what is going to happen. Convinced that my previous suffering would have been better than this dangerous precipice. Sure, it could lead to freedom, but it could just as easily lead to ruin. But it's just at that point that Moses does something that breaks the hearts of the people open. Because in these moments of heartbreak, we can be broken or we can be broken open, expanding and making space for newness and transformation. And Moses went right to it when he said, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm. See. You have only to be still." But Moses, there is everything to fear. If I stand firm, I'll be trampled by my pursuers. There is nothing to see but a wall of impossibility and impassibility. Stillness just makes everything worse. I can't. But what about, do not be afraid. Stand firm. See. You have only to be still. What a perfect, impossible, necessary invitation. Remember, nothing has happened yet. This is the height of the drama, the point where the violins are raging and your little arm hairs are standing on end and you're freaking out and you're going, how is this ever going to be okay? And at that moment, Moses calls them to stillness. The phrase most repeated throughout the Bible is, "Do not be afraid." I sometimes wonder if God feels like a broken record, having to remind us over and over again to slow down and take a deep breath and trust. This slowness and this stillness is often counterintuitive and is certainly countercultural. But in the moments between despair and deliverance, it's all we can do. And it's the best thing that we can do. Because in this stillness, we can hold our fear tenderly. We can stand firmly, accepting the present moment as it is. We can begin to see with the eyes of faith beyond our present circumstances. It's not easy at first, but with practice, with intention, with cultivation, it's all we need. What a radical invitation. What a sweeping and essential call. So here's where we get to the fun part. We're going to practice. I even brought a stool so I can be nice and comfy. So, a couple minutes. We're just going to sit, and eyes closed, eyes open, taking long, deep breaths. Yes, I'm a yoga teacher. Some nice deep breaths, but to do just as Moses says. Do not be afraid. Stand firm. See. You have only to be still. Do not be afraid. Stand firm. See. You have only to be still. What else is there? What else could there be? This story teaches us everything. It gives us hope that in time, the tides will sweep away evil and injustice, and freedom and love will shine. But it also shows us that in our wandering, worrying, wondering moments, we are called to release our fear, to stand still with ease, to see with the eyes of faith. May we learn this practice, invite this rhythm, and be transformed while we are in the wilderness. Amen.